Since 2025 is the year of the wood snake, symbolizing wisdom, transformation, and personal growth, why not celebrate by drawing a snake front? Although it doesn't quite fit the rule of thirds, I liked this thumbnail sketch best, so it's the one I'll be working on. I'll also be referencing some sketches of mini flora from a former travel journal when I visited Scotland. Yes, Sumi, I know how passionate you are about art making. Let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming. Bet this looks like I'm drawing nothing. Well, from this angle, sure, it's tough to capture on camera. But picture a bunch of lightly ghosted blue lines. Better yet, let's just fast forward. Here's a few of the pencils I'll be using as part of my color palette. Can you tell what my favorite color is? Yes, this is actually how slow I work at the beginning stages. Since the snake is so central to this piece, I'm trying to be a little bit more intentional about my lines, which doesn't always work. Since the eraser isn't always powerful enough to erase some of the color pencil marks, I sometimes use sandpaper. Well, I messed this line up again. Screw it, we're just gonna keep drawing alongside this messed up line. Often I have this internal back and forth when I think about what kind of art or illustration I like to make. I've probably talked about it here before, but I experience this tug of war between a more simplistic versus a more maximalist, drafted, detailed style. I love the directness of a simple image, but on the other hand, I also adore the storytelling and immersiveness of a detailed piece. And maybe this kind of drawing embraces both worlds. I tried to make the snake pretty spare and unassuming, while the details that surround it are lush and indulgent. Maybe that's one of the reasons I've always been so drawn to animation and manga. Often its characters are represented in a more simplistic visual shorthand, in contrast with these super detailed backgrounds. Not always, I know, but I feel like the ones I'm most drawn to have this going on. There's this phenomenon that Scott McCloud talks about in Understanding Comics, which is a great read, by the way. How the further simplified or abstracted a face is rendered, the more universal it becomes. It's this universality, he argues, which helps a viewer or reader identify more with the character. Iconic characters mixed with realistic backgrounds, quote, allows readers to mask themselves in a character and safely enter a sensually stimulating world. One set of lines to see, another set of lines to be, unquote. He goes on to say, icons demand our participation in order to make them work. There is no life here except that which you give it. All that to say, there's more to a goofy little drawing than meets the eye. But seriously, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud is... On the topic of books, what am I currently reading? Well, right now I'm approaching the last few chapters of Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. It's a retelling of Dickens's David Copperfield, set in southern Appalachia during the early aughts. While the only Dickens work I've ever read was Great Expectations back in high school, the little I remember of it was how vivid his character descriptions were. And with Dickens, I think Kingsolver is particularly strong at creating vivid characters with evocative descriptions. But maybe one of her biggest strengths seems to be the musicality with which she writes and the strength of voice of her main character. Even if unfamiliar with Appalachian culture, as I surely am, the immersiveness of the language and descriptions transported me to a different time and place. Her main character, Demon, which is a moniker, navigates the American foster system and later the opioid epidemic. It's a harrowing journey that's giving me glimpses of worlds I know nothing about, which, is what books do best. And can I just say, I'm so impressed that Barbara Kingsolver knows who Gone Freaks is. The lady really does her research. Oh, and you might have been wondering what I've been looking at on my phone while drawing in this shot. They're actually reference photos that I've collected on Pinterest of tiny lichen, fungi, and baby ferns. As far as I'm concerned, what's not to like about lichen? I'm finally done with the outlining stage. Here she is in all her glory. I will regret this. Next comes filling everything in. I'm not sure how the color looks to you on your screen, but I'm actually using a black grape pencil. It's sort of a desaturated dark purple. Pure black felt a little too harsh to use on this illustration. If you can remember it, this illustration is somewhat similar in execution to the rabbit I made a few years ago, also for Lunar New Year, except an ultramarine blue was used in place of a black grape pencil. While working on that one, I remember feeling like I'd somehow ruined the simplicity of the blue on white by adding more colors, and I sort of felt that way while adding color to the snake. Of course, ultimately I was happy with the finished color, but in the moment I felt like I was misstepping. But I guess that's just a result of the stakes feeling higher when you work traditionally. There are no takesies backsies after all. Really, I think I just got spoiled by working digitally. Before you lay down color, the world of possibilities is still open to you. But once you start laying down 2 or 3 hues, that world slowly closes up and narrows your focus. Which is not a bad thing. It's both nerve-wracking and exciting. Like playing a game of Go with a really big piece of paper. But probably less brain cells required here. I hope your wrists don't feel secondhand strain while watching this, though admittedly I've been pretty lucky to avoid wrist injuries thus far. That's not to say I haven't had any repetitive strain injuries, but up to this point they've mostly affected my shoulder, neck, or back. Hello, posture. Fortunately, with a little rest, these pains eventually subsided, but they were always my body's way of reminding me not to take it for granted. So whenever the problem areas start to flare up, usually when I have crazy deadlines, I try to fit in as many stretch breaks as possible. And on off hours, I try to do my best goth gym rat cosplay and hit up the weights. And sometimes I do yoga in my apartment. But to be honest, my wrist felt fine while working on this. So, at this point, my previous stock of 2 black grape pencils had started to run out. An art store run was long overdue, so I swung over to Blick's and picked up these guys. Along with 2 new black grape pencils. Topic change. I know newsletters are all the rage these days due to the topsy-turvy of social media. And let me just say, I've seen a lot of platforms laid to rest in my time, and maybe that's why I've never felt particularly attached to one of them in the first place. And why you're in for the days of blogs. But recently, one of my favorite newsletters is that of a conductor named Daniel Zen, who emails a weekly list of classical concerts in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Last summer, while working on my short box comic, I may or may not have gotten really into Baroque music. So much so that I made a 10-hour playlist. Like they say, go Baroque or go home. Anyway, ever since last fall, I've been going to a few of these concerts. Many times they take place in these historic Gothic cathedrals too, so added eye candy while I listen to live music. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I may as well be sitting at a site of grace in the Church of Baroque. Sorry, I couldn't resist an Elden Ring reference. I know, it probably sounds so stuffy. The light scent of incense, the religious effigies, and the cold, hard pews. The thing is, while I'm into a whole bunch of different musical genres, I find crowds in larger music venues a little too overwhelming. Just a personal preference. Unless we're talking about a dance floor, that's a whole different story. But I've been to 4 Baroque concerts since this first one back in October, and it just feels very intimate hearing the instruments reverberate against the hard surfaces with no microphones or speakers necessary. Everyone in the audience nodding along like flesh and blood metronomes. I also love when you can tell how familiar an older audience member is with the song and witness their anticipatory sways and pauses. How many times have they listened to that song in their lifetime? What memory associations do they have with it? Added bonus that it feels really good to support local musicians. My palette selection had become a little unruly at this point, so I gathered them into a little bouquet to keep them sorted. Sorry, more Elden Ring discussion. Speaking of the Church of America, I've finally made it to crumbling Farum Azula. Why is everything there so scary? Why are there so many opportunities for my character to fall to her death? And why does Hidetaka Miyazaki keep putting rare items on distant floating pieces of rubble suspended above a void? And I gotta hustle past these beastmen? So mean. You can see why I spend so much time in this game whimpering and fleeing. One of the reasons why I've had enough time to work on this time-intensive piece is that my Januaries are usually pretty light on client work. Whether it's because clients are sorting out budgets in the new fiscal year or still sorting themselves out, it just happens to be a trend I've seen throughout my years of freelancing. In downtimes like these, what better use of time than to explore the type of work that no one pays me to do? Namely, the kind of work that I want to make. Which I guess happens to be a silly little snake at the moment. What else have I been up to? For the first week of January, I took up the Center for Cartooning Studies' free 1-week cartooning workout. Essentially, each day of the week is devoted to a different mini-challenge, each one being a component in making a comic. Although it was tough to remain consistent, I thought the cartooning workout was really fun. Prior to this, I'd been struggling with writing another one-shot to work on. However, I always get caught up in the writing portion of it, making my life seemingly harder and harder by laboring over a multi-draft script. But the workout forced me to simplify and break each component down into manageable steps, at the end of which I had 2 new comics, one being a 2-pager and the other an 8-pager. Wow! I think it's the perfect sort of thing to work on if you're feeling rusty or just need a place to get started with comics, or even just want to build comics making into a habit. In my case, I needed a little of all 3. Also, because the challenges are relatively fast-paced, I wasn't afforded enough time to get stuck in my own head about the process. I was able to make stuff without getting hampered by my inner critic. And I didn't have to worry about whether something was good or bad, because the only thing I was focused on was the making. And that was so refreshing. If you're interested in what I ended up making, I have a whole post about it on my Patreon, as well as the 2 comics that came out of it. One features 2 swordswomen and possibly a shank. The other is an autobio about the time I lived in a haunted pre-war apartment. It turns out I really like challenges like this when I have time to do them. I also recently took up the self-challenge of writing 1,000 words of fiction per day for an entire week. As of my saying this, I'm already 5 days in, and it's been challenging but fun. I've been writing short stories mostly with a sci-fi or horror bent. The tough part has been to keep going even when I don't feel like writing, or when I'm not exactly hearing the words that need to come next. But it's satisfying when I manage to press on and hit my word count. Closing my laptop once that happens is like the best feeling. I'll let you know if I survive. Recently, I decided to subscribe to Criterion Channel. Figure I might as well see what some of these quote-unquote masterpiece films are like. The most recent film I watched was Chinese Odyssey 2002, directed by Jeffrey Lau and starring Fei Wong and Tony Leung. Aesthetically speaking, it's a really pretty film, but also hella silly. Like deliberately bad fight choreography. There's some wuxia stuff too, or making another character fly across the room with flirting eyes fighting style. Goofy stuff. So just my type. It likes to parody Wong Kar-wai's style too, while paying homage. All the sillier because Wong Kar-wai produced it. You have these layered shots with foreground elements framing the characters in a beautiful way, as well as Wong Kar-wai's tendency to film broody slow-mos as the characters navigate their internal space. Not all of its jokes landed for me, but I did laugh a lot. There's this Rashomon-like narrative device that Lau uses, where characters will perceive each other internally in vastly different ways, at odds with each other's sense of reality, and usually within the span of mere seconds. Oh, and there's a ton of gender bending, which is never itself made a gag, and that's something that I really appreciated about it. But certainly it causes a lot of ensuing comedies of error for the characters to later run into. And surprisingly, there are quite a lot of tender moments as a result as well. But I'd love to know, maybe you have some Criterion Channel recommendations. Sadly, even dusting these pencil shavings off with a brush, I can still never fully get them out. And I can't brush them too hard, otherwise I risk smudging. I've tried pressing tape to the shavings too, in order to suction some of them up, but I can't say that works as well as the brush. Do you ever deal with this problem too? If so, any solutions? I tend to press pretty hard while I draw in order to maximize the butteriness of the color consistency, which I think exacerbates the whole smudging thing. So at this point, I've learned to tolerate them. Kind of like how when you live with a dog or cat, you just have to learn to live with cleaning up after a whole lot of fur. What do you suppose these guys are talking about? I like to think that they're having a secret little meeting to discuss their weekend plans. Maybe going on a hot girl walk in the sun to refresh their little cold-blooded bods before gossing it up with the dragonflies and snails at the local watering hole. Actually, when I was a kid, I used to sketch these drawings with multiple characters in one detailed, or what felt detailed at the time, environment. Without actually writing anything down, I'd make up conversations between them. Sort of like I was putting on my own picture book reading for myself. Yeah, I spent a lot of time alone as a kid. Wow, I guess not much has changed in my life since then. Here's how the final drawing looks. Happy Lunar New Year, and I hope you had a restorative holiday. And I also hope you're surrounding yourself with a supportive, loving community. My aim is to provide a tiny oasis of calm here, though I know the wider world has been turbulent and troubling. If I'm being real here, things are scary right now. May we all recharge, take a breath, and keep going. If you've made it this far, thanks so much for sticking around until the end. See you next time.